When it comes to the retro-style stages in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, it's easy to get the impression that there was less care or consideration given to them on a technical level. Their graphics and aesthetics are relatively simple and call back to an era where more realistic rendering techniques had not yet emerged in the field of real-time computer graphics. At the same time, Smash Ultimate is still a modern game, with a modern engine and still incorporates some of that realism into these stages, whether by way of the characters, lighting, shadows, or some other component, so the technical challenge then comes from the need to strike a balance between the old and the new. Sometimes this can be difficult to do when you're trying to emulate the look of a game that was technically constructed in a completely different way compared to how modern games are made now. And this was undoubtedly the case for some of the retro-style stages in Smash Ultimate, like 75 meters, where its fully three-dimensional environment appears to be almost visually identical to the original Donkey Kong game. So how did the developers accomplish such a feat? Well, that's what we'll be examining today in this episode of Smash Labs. As you might have gleaned from our series premiere, the general approach to visually representing the different game worlds in Smash Ultimate seems to involve a lot of visual trickery. And 75 meters, or 75M as we'll be calling it for the rest of this episode, might very well be one of the very best examples of this. And if you couldn't tell by now, Smash Labs is all about revealing the magician's secrets, so if you still want to believe in magic, now might be a good time to tune out. Still here? Good, because things are about to get very interesting. So there appears to be a few key elements that Bandai Namco took into account when creating the illusion that 75M is two-dimensional. All of these elements relate to human depth perception, since it's depth perception that allows our brains to interpret a scene or objects as three-dimensional, and this function becomes increasingly limited when there are less depth cues available for our brains to interpret. Removing such depth cues, then, was key to 75M achieving visual parity with its proverbial progenitor. Now there are actually two main categories for depth cues, monocular cues and binocular cues. However, the latter set doesn't really apply to virtual environments unless you have a monitor capable of displaying stereoscopic 3D content, so we won't be talking about those cues here. But monocular depth cues are very much perceptible on a 2D screen, and those are the cues that the developers took great care to minimize for 75M. The first of these cues is based on a fundamental principle of shading. The complex relationship between the light and/or shadow visible on different sections of a given surface can tell us a lot about that surface's depth. So it stands to reason that simplifying the appearance of light and shadow as much as possible will result in the loss of depth information for that surface. In the case of 75M, a shading technique known as flat shading allowed for the developers to achieve that simplification. With flat shading, each polygon of a mesh is uniformly colored with a specific shade, and that color is segmented from adjacent polygons which have their own shades of color, causing the appearance of distinct edges between differently colored polygons. This discontinuous type of shading between geometric faces gives off the appearance of flat surfaces being stitched together, and can play a big role in making 3D objects appear not only flat, but pixelated at certain angles. You can see the difference between this technique and the more realistic shading technique known as smooth shading here. In 75M, only the characters and items use smooth shading, creating an interesting contrast between the characters and their environment. But the trickery doesn't end here. After all, the Wii U version of 75M utilizes flat shading as well, and yet, it still somehow manages to look three-dimensional compared to the Ultimate version. So why is that exactly? Well, the key difference between the two has to do with another depth cue known as perspective. This cue typically allows us to perceive completely parallel lines as converging, the farther they appear in the distance towards a vanishing point. So you can imagine if the parallel lines converge as they appear farther away, the opposite effect happens if parallel lines appear closer to you. And indeed, that is the case with the Wii U version of 75M, as we can see that all of the platforms appear to diverge away from the center of the stage, revealing its three-dimensional composition. So how does the Ultimate version of this stage manage to avoid showing any divergence between its platforms from this view? Well, there are quite a few ways that this can be accomplished, but the main two methods boil down to how the virtual camera is set up. You can get rid of converging or diverging lines with an orthographic camera or a perspective camera. With an orthographic camera, this process is automatic, as it inherently does not show any perspective between parallel lines at any distance. This has the effect of multiple identical objects remaining at the same size, regardless of how far away one is from the other. With a perspective camera, normally an object that's identical to another object will appear to be smaller than that object the farther away that it is. But this effect can actually be negated if you narrow the angle of view to a very low degree. So with both camera types being capable of making lines appear parallel at any distance, how do we know which one Smash Ultimate is using for this stage? Well, after some rigorous testing, the answer became quite clear. Out of the two camera types, only one of them actually moves in and out of a scene in order to change its zoom, and that's the perspective camera. In order to change the zoom of an orthographic camera, you'd actually have to change the scale of the camera itself. Simply moving the camera in and out of the scene would accomplish nothing, as objects seen by an orthographic camera will retain their apparent size, regardless of how close or far away the camera was to or from the object. So if you keep in mind the zooming limitations of the orthographic camera, figuring out how the camera is actually zooming in 75mm becomes a matter of looking for any objects that get clipped or culled out of view if you zoom in too closely. If the object intersects with the camera's near clipping plane or gets culled out of view, we know that the camera is actually moving through the scene and can deduce that a perspective camera is being used. If the object simply fills the screen without ever clipping or culling out of view, we can deduce that an orthographic camera is being used. However, determining this is not as easy as it sounds, since the game does not let you zoom in indefinitely. Nevertheless, there are a few points in the stage that let you get close enough to reach a conclusion. So which one is it? Well, considering this culling only occurs at certain zoom levels and angles, it's pretty safe to assume that the stage uses a perspective camera, just one with a very narrow field of view. So, mystery solved. Or has it? So far, we've been able to deduce that the stage uses flat shading and a narrow field of view perspective camera in order to emulate the two-dimensional look of the original Donkey Kong game. But if we rotate the camera in the Ultimate version, it's still very clear that the stage is comprised of three-dimensional models, simply due to how the different sides of an object transform when being viewed from different angles in motion. Thankfully, there was one more technique at the developer's disposal that could help mitigate this issue, and they've made great use of it here thanks to the other techniques already being employed, although it is strictly limited to the camera's default angular position. This technique is known as forced perspective. It's an optical illusion often used in photography where the known limitations of human depth perception are exploited to make objects appear to be closer, farther, smaller, or bigger than they actually are. As long as the camera doesn't rotate beyond this specific orientation, it's free to move translationally in any direction, and all of the objects in the scene will still appear to exist on the same plane, just like in the original game. Pretty neat, huh? So as you've no doubt concluded by this point, even a stage with primitively simplistic aesthetics like 75M has tons of care poured into it that helps to faithfully represent the series that it comes from, which is yet another testament to Sakurai and Bandai Namco's dedication to paying proper tribute to Nintendo's rich history. And that concludes this episode of Smash Labs. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to give it a like and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. There's still much more to uncover in the weeks and months to come, so hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and be sure to stay tuned to GameXplain for more coverage on all things gaming. Cheers!